Pam Bondi had been in tough court cases before. She was strong, smart, and never afraid to stand up for what was right. But today felt different. Something wasn't normal. She stood in a big courtroom facing Judge Victor Langston. He was known for being rude, strict, and unpredictable. Some people feared him. Others said he enjoyed making lawyers nervous. Pam had prepared a strong case, but she didn't prepare for what was about to happen. The case was about a rich developer. He was accused of taking government money and using it for himself instead of public projects. This was a serious crime. If Pam won, it could change a lot of things for powerful people. Maybe that's why Judge Langston seemed so unhappy to see her. Pam walked to the plaintiff's table, standing tall and confident. She was ready to present her case. But before she could say anything, Judge Langston flipped through some papers slowly, ignoring her. The courtroom was silent. It wasn't the normal kind of silence before a case started. This silence felt uncomfortable, like the judge was making a point. Finally he spoke. But he didn't even look at her. "Miss Bondi," he said in a lazy voice, "I hope you have something important to say today. Or should we skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" Some people in the courtroom chuckled, mostly from the other side, the defense team. Pam ignored them. She had dealt with worse. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her voice calm, "the facts will speak for themselves. This case is about taxpayer money being misused. My job is to make sure the truth is heard." Judge Langston leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Oh, taxpayer money. Right. Because we've never seen a case built on that before." His voice was full of sarcasm. Pam's jaw tightened, but she stayed calm. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I wouldn't call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a moment their eyes met. His gaze was cold, calculating. Hers was strong, unwavering. She wouldn't back down. But he wasn't done. "Miss Bondi, spare me the lecture," he interrupted again. "Just get to the point. I don't have all day to listen to whatever grand speech you have planned." A few murmurs spread through the courtroom. Something was wrong. Judges were supposed to be tough, but this was personal. Pam took a deep breath. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He wanted to throw her off balance, make her nervous. He wanted her to feel small, but she wouldn't let that happen. She opened a folder and held up a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A." Judge Langston smirked and interrupted her again. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of making up for something?" The courtroom fell silent. That comment wasn't just rude, it was inappropriate. Even the defense lawyer looked surprised. Pam didn't react. She knew men like Langston. They used insults to throw people off. The best way to beat them was to show no fear. She paused, just for a moment, then set the folder down gently and clasped her hands together. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "if you would prefer to continue making this personal, I am happy to request a recess while we discuss any concerns you may have." It was subtle, not rude, not aggressive, but sharp. A warning. Judge Langston tilted his head slightly. Was he amused? Annoyed? It was hard to tell. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said, smirking. "I just know a weak case when I see one." This time the room didn't just murmur. People gasped. Judges weren't supposed to say things like that. Pam stayed calm. She could feel the room shifting. The people watching weren't just observing anymore. They were paying attention. Instead of arguing, she simply straightened her blazer, adjusted her papers, and met his eyes. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she saw something in his expression. Something deeper than arrogance. A flicker of something else. Like a man who had something to hide. And that's when she knew, this wasn't just about courtroom drama. Judge Langston wasn't just being rude for no reason. He had a stake in this case. But what he didn't know was that Pam had something too. Pam kept going, moving through her arguments. Every time she spoke, Judge Langston was ready to interrupt. She could see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tapping of his fingers on the bench. He was waiting for a moment to cut her off. She wasn't about to let that happen. "Your Honor," she said steadily, "these documents show a clear problem. The defendant's company received nearly 3 times the approved amount in state funds. And none of that money was recorded in state accounts." She turned, pointing at the big screen where the financial records were displayed. "If you look here." "Miss Bondi," Judge Langston said, interrupting again. His voice had that same smug tone. "I hate to interrupt. Really, I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers today." Pam looked at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even pretending anymore. "With all due respect, Your Honor, these numbers are the foundation of this case," she said. Judge Langston scoffed. "Right. And And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting this court's time. That word again. Wasting time. He was trying to shut this case down before it even started. Behind her, Pam could hear the quiet shuffling of papers. The sound of her team shifting. They knew it too. Something wasn't right. Pam took a breath and turned to her next page. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to... Denied, Langston said, cutting her off before she even finished her sentence. Silence. Pam looked up. I haven't even started my motion yet, she said. And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere, Langston said, leaning forward. People in the courtroom looked at each other. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi, he said, shaking his head. This entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting and suddenly you're crying corruption. The defense lawyer in his navy suit smirked. He hadn't even needed to argue. Langston was doing all the work for him. Pam exhaled slowly. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing what it is? Pause. Too long. Then. I'm refusing to let this circus act go on any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it had shifted. People were paying attention. Pam glanced at the jury. One woman in a dark blazer furrowed her brows, pressing her lips together. Others exchanged glances. Even the reporters in the back were writing faster. That's the thing about power, it makes people watch. And now, Pam Bondi knew she wasn't the only one who saw what was happening. This wasn't over. Not even close. Bondi stood tall, shoulders straight. All right, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. Judge Langston nodded. Let's move on to the next piece of evidence. She turned to the large screen behind her and clicked to the next slide. This document, she said, pointing at the screen, was obtained through a subpoena. But then she stopped. Something was wrong. Judge Langston was different now. Before, he had been leaning back in his chair, looking relaxed, almost smug. But not anymore. Now he sat up straight. His hands were pressed together. His mouth was a thin, tight line. His entire expression had changed. The room felt different. Bondi glanced at him, and for a second she wondered, was he nervous? And then his voice cut through the silence. Approach the bench. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Bondi hesitated. The courtroom was silent, waiting. Slowly, she set down her papers, took a deep breath, and walked toward him. As she reached the judge's bench, he lowered his voice, just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest, he murmured, that you reconsider the direction you're taking here. Bondi tilted her head. Excuse me? The judge's eyes locked onto hers. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it. Something dark. I'm saying, he continued, that some fights aren't worth having. She let those words hang in the air between them. A warning. A threat. She studied his face. He wasn't just telling her to stop, he was warning her. But why? She had expected pushback today. She knew not everyone wanted her in this courtroom. She even knew some people might try to make her job harder. But this was something different. This wasn't just bias. Judge Langston was protecting something. Or someone. Her heartbeat quickened, but she didn't show it. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, leaned in just an inch closer. I don't scare easily, Judge Langston. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Bondi didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to her table. That moment told her everything she needed to know. Judge Langston wasn't just playing favorites. He had something to lose. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, keeping her face neutral. Beside her, her team shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin, looked directly at the judge, and spoke. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Judge Langston didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch. Then finally he said, proceed. But keep it brief. Bondi didn't react to the jab. She simply picked up the next document and held it up. This, she said, is a contract. It shows the agreement between the defendant and the city's planning board. She placed it on the projector so everyone could see. The listed cost for the project is just over $2 million. She paused and picked up another document. But this, she said, placing it beside the first, is an internal ledger from the defendant's company. She pointed at the numbers on the page. It shows that the actual amount of money transferred was nearly double that amount. A murmur ran through the courtroom. People shifted in their seats. And then Bondi picked up a third document. She held it in her hands for just a moment longer than necessary. This was the moment. She carefully placed the paper down on the projector. This, she said, is the approval signature. She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment land. The signature belonged to Judge Victor Langston. The entire courtroom shifted. It was as if a crack had just appeared in the room, spreading through the air. People moved. Eyes darted from one person to another. Pens scratched across notebooks. The defense lawyer, who had looked so smug just minutes ago, suddenly stiffened. His face changed. Judge Langston? He didn't move. For the first time, his expression was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang for a moment longer before she spoke again. Your Honor, she said carefully, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? It was a risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but she had enough to shake him. Judge Langston finally moved. His fingers pressed together. His knuckles turned white. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled, he said. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. The reaction wasn't just from the audience. It was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Bondi crossed her arms. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? She asked. That the media is here? That everyone in this room just saw you dismiss critical financial evidence without reason? Judge Langston's jaw tightened. That's enough, Miss Bondi. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly she sat down. And then, she did something that changed everything. She reached into her bag. She pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table. She pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom. Rough. Familiar. Take care of it. I don't care how. The recording crackled. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Bondi didn't look at Judge Langston. She didn't need to, because now everyone had heard him. The defense lawyer blinked. His expression changed. No more smirk. Just dread. He looked at his client, the rich developer. The man whose entire business was built on shady deals and favors. The man looked pale. Judge Langston cleared his throat. Ms. Bondi, he said, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but that's not the question you should be asking, she interrupted. Her voice was unwavering. The real question is, who were you talking to? Judge Langston's fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is turning into a circus. Bondi raised an eyebrow. A circus? She repeated, amused. I'd say this is clarity. The room felt smaller. The tension thicker. Bondi let it breathe. Then she reached for another document. She slid it across the table. Your Honor, she said, this is a transcript of a legally obtained wiretap. She tapped the top of the page. It confirms everything we just heard. Judge Langston stared at the paper, but he didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell. His breathing was louder now. Bondi turned slightly, looking toward the bailiff. Officer Mark, she said, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? The bailiff hesitated. Then he picked up the transcript. We'll take care of her, he read. Bondi doesn't have proof yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never reaches a courtroom. A sharp inhale came from the gallery. Judge Langston's eyes flickered toward the exit. A tiny movement, but it was enough. He was thinking about running, but it was far too late for that. Motion denied, he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? This hearing is over. He was shouting now. I will not allow. Judge Langston, Bondi said smoothly, I wasn't asking for your permission. And then, she made her final move. Pam Bondi turned her head slightly, her eyes moving toward the back of the courtroom. She gave the smallest, almost invisible nod. A door opened. The sound of footsteps echoed loudly against the shiny, polished floor. Then a strong, serious voice spoke, clear and firm for the entire courtroom to hear. Judge Victor Langston, you are under arrest. For a second there was complete silence. Then, gasps filled the room. People turned to each other in shock, whispering in hushed voices. Reporters, caught off guard, scrambled for their phones. Some dropped their pens in surprise. Others reached for their cameras, trying to capture the unbelievable moment. The jury members, who had been sitting still, trying to stay neutral, could no longer hide their reactions. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly open. Even the defendant, the rich and powerful man sitting at the defense table, looked completely stunned. He had come into this trial believing it was just a formality, Just a small step before he would walk free. But now his face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Judge Victor Langston sat frozen. He didn't turn his head. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at the wooden desk in front of him. Maybe if he didn't move, this wouldn't be real. Maybe if he stayed completely still, he could make this moment disappear. But he couldn't, because reality had finally caught up with him. Two uniformed police officers stepped forward, standing on either side of the judge. One officer reached into his pocket. The other officer pulled out a pair of shiny silver handcuffs. Judge Langston's fingers twitched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His voice, when it finally came, was weak. "This is absurd," he muttered. But even he didn't sound convinced. The officer standing to his right didn't blink. His voice was steady, calm, and completely serious as he began speaking. "Judge Victor Langston, you have the right to remain silent." For the first time in his entire career, Judge Langston actually was. Then click. The sound of the metal cuffs locking around his wrists rang out, sharp and final. The once powerful judge, who had spent years sitting above others, making decisions about their fate, was now trapped in his own. His face twisted in disbelief. His mouth opened again, but no words came out. The entire courtroom erupted into whispers and murmurs. People turned to one another, whispering hurriedly. Did that really just happen? Did they just arrest a judge? I can't believe it. Reporters were typing furiously, writing down everything they could. Even the jury, who had sworn to stay neutral, couldn't stop themselves from staring in shock. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't about victory. This was about justice. Judge Langston finally seemed to find his voice again. It was low, barely above a whisper, as if he himself didn't believe the words. "You can't do this." The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." He paused, then continued. "You will have the right to speak with an attorney." Judge Langston yanked against the cuffs. His face turned red with anger. "This is a disgrace," he barked. "I am the law in this courtroom." Pam Bondi finally stood up. She smoothed the front of her blazer, adjusting it neatly. Then she met his eyes. Not anymore. For the first time, fear flashed across Judge Langston's face. The officers tightened their grip on him, pulling him up from his chair. But he resisted. "This is political. This is..." Pam shook her head. "No," she said simply. "This is accountability." The room fell silent again. Judge Langston looked around. His eyes moved across the courtroom, searching for someone who would stand up for him. Someone who would say, "This is a mistake." Someone who would defend him. But no one did. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. A few feet away, the defense attorney looked pale. The developer, the rich businessman who had believed his influence would protect him, was shaking. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. His breathing was shallow. Pam let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and even, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Judge Langston's mouth opened, then shut again. Because what could he say? The officers started moving toward the exit, leading him away. But before they could reach the door, someone else finally spoke. Wait. All eyes turned. The developer, Charles Lawson, was standing now. His chair had scraped loudly against the floor when he shot up. His eyes flickered between Judge Langston and Pam Bondi, moving back and forth like he was trying to understand what was happening. "This is getting out of hand," he said quickly. His voice was different now. Less confident. Less smug. More afraid. "We can work something out." Pam arched an eyebrow. "Work something out?" Lawson swallowed. I mean there's no need for this to be such a public thing. Let's be reasonable." Pam studied him for a moment. Then she took a single step forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." Lawson let out a weak, forced laugh. "Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously think Langston is guilty, do you?" Pam let his words sit in the air for a long moment before finally responding. "Do you?" Silence. Lawson didn't answer. Because he knew the truth. The officers continued walking Judge Langston toward the door. And just like that, he was gone. Hauled out of the courtroom. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room like a heavy fog. This wasn't just one case anymore. This was the unraveling of an entire system. Pam Bondi wasn't finished. She turned her gaze back to the jury. To the judge's now empty seat. To the defense table. I believe we still have a trial to finish." But everyone in that courtroom knew this was only the beginning. The room felt different now, lighter. Like a dark cloud had been lifted. Judge Langston was gone, and the world had just changed. Pam Bondi adjusted the papers in front of her and looked straight at Charles Lawson. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice firm, "would you like to continue today's proceedings? Or would you prefer to discuss a plea deal?" Lawson's jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Pam gave a small smile. "No, Mr. Lawson. This is justice." And with that, the trial continued. But one thing was clear. No one was above the law. And this was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.